Hello, my beautiful Aries. I hope you're doing well. So, today we're going to take a look at the energy surrounding this connection and the person who simply can't seem to forget you. As always, take what resonates and leave what doesn't. Every story unfolds a little differently. Okay, I have to say, before I even pull the cards, this energy feels intense. There's someone here who thought they could move on. Someone who tried to convince themselves that this chapter was over. But the more distance that grows between you, the more they seem to realize what you actually meant to them. Let's see what's really happening beneath the surface, Aries. Okay, Aries. I have to say, the energy coming through here feels surprisingly emotional. There's someone who has been trying very hard to convince themselves that they're fine, trying to stay busy, trying to focus on everything else, trying to move forward one day at a time. But the strange thing is, the harder they push this connection into the background, the more it seems to find its way back into their thoughts. And the very first card that catches my attention is the Judgment card. Not because someone is being judged, not because anyone is being punished. It feels more like a moment of realization. A moment where something they have been avoiding becomes impossible to ignore. You know, I keep hearing the words, "Why am I still thinking about this?" Because that's what seems to frustrate this person the most. They thought enough time had passed. They thought enough distance had been created. They thought they had already made peace with whatever happened between the two of you. And yet here they are, still remembering, still wondering, still comparing every new experience to something they felt with you. And Aries, I don't think they expected that. Honestly, I think part of them believed that eventually your memory would fade into the background of their life. But instead, something very different happened. Certain moments started bringing you back to mind. Certain conversations reminded them of you. Certain feelings they experienced with other people only highlighted what was missing. The Six of Cups is sitting here, and the energy around it feels incredibly reflective. This person keeps revisiting memories, not necessarily because they want to live in the past, but because they're beginning to see those memories differently. Moments they once dismissed now feel important. Conversations they barely paid attention to now carry meaning. Even things they once found confusing about you are becoming the exact things they miss. It's almost as if distance has given them a completely different perspective. And Aries, I have to be honest, I don't feel like this realization arrived all at once. It feels gradual, quiet, unexpected. Like somebody opening an old photo album and suddenly noticing details they overlooked the first time. Because what keeps coming through is that this person underestimated your impact on their life. They saw your presence, but they didn't fully understand your value. They saw your affection, but they didn't fully understand how rare it was. They saw your loyalty, but they assumed it would always be there. And now they're looking back and realizing how much of you they took for granted. The World card is also here. And what I find interesting is that it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like perspective. Like someone standing at a higher point and finally seeing the entire landscape. They're connecting dots that never made sense before. They're recognizing patterns. They're noticing how often your energy has appeared throughout different chapters of their life. And for some of you, I feel like this person has tried very hard to rationalize what they feel. They've tried to explain it away, tried to label it, tried to convince themselves that it's nothing unusual. But every explanation seems to fall short. Because the truth is, Aries, what they're experiencing doesn't fit neatly into the categories they're used to. You feel different to them. And I think that's the part they're only beginning to admit. Not necessarily to you, not necessarily to anyone else, but to themselves. That's where the real shift is happening. The private conversations they're having in their own mind. The moments when nobody else is around. The moments when they stop distracting themselves long enough to feel what they've been avoiding. And those moments seem to be happening more often lately. Because the energy around these cards keeps bringing me back to one simple realization. This person may have tried to move on, but moving on and forgetting are two very different things. And what they're starting to understand is that forgetting you was never as easy as they thought it would be. Something about your energy continues to stay with them. Something about your presence continues to echo through their memories. And the more they try to understand why, the more questions seem to appear. Questions they're not quite ready to answer yet, because some of those questions are leading this person somewhere they never expected to go. Aries, I keep seeing somebody sitting with thoughts they've been avoiding for a very long time. Not thoughts about you specifically at first. Thoughts about themselves, about the life they've built, about the choices they've made, about the rules they've been living by without ever stopping to ask where those rules came from. And as I shuffle, The Hierophant keeps catching my attention, not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way. It's almost uncomfortable, like somebody suddenly realizing that half of their decisions weren't actually theirs. You know what I mean? Sometimes people spend years following a path because it's what their family expected, their friends expected, their community expected, maybe even because it's what they expected from themselves. And eventually they wake up one day and wonder, wait a second, do I even want this? That's the energy surrounding this person. Because I don't feel like they're only questioning this connection. I feel like they're questioning everything, the way they love, the way they communicate, the way they define success, the people they keep around them, the version of themselves they've been trying so hard to maintain. And honestly, Aries, I think that's exhausting them. Because when you start seeing cracks in something you've believed for years, you can't unsee them. You can try. You can distract yourself. You can stay busy. You can convince yourself everything is fine. But somewhere in the background, the truth keeps whispering. The tower is sitting right beside the Hierophant, and I have to say, this doesn't feel like a sudden explosion. It feels like a slow collapse, like a building that looked strong from the outside but was already weakening underneath. This person is beginning to notice things they used to ignore. Certain friendships don't feel supportive anymore. Certain conversations leave them feeling drained. Certain environments that once felt familiar suddenly feel restrictive. And the strange thing is, Aries, they're not entirely sure why. They're just noticing that things no longer fit the way they used to. I keep hearing somebody say, I don't feel like myself anymore. But the deeper truth might be that they're finally becoming themselves. And that's a very different thing, because becoming yourself often requires letting go of versions of yourself that other people liked, versions that felt safe, versions that earned approval, versions that never challenged the status quo. Okay, that feels important. Because I think approval has played a much bigger role in this person's life than they want to admit. Not because they're weak, not because they're fake, but because somewhere along the way, they learned that acceptance was conditional. That being loved required performing. That belonging required fitting in. And when someone like you entered their life, Aries, something shifted. You weren't asking them to perform. You weren't asking them to become somebody else. You simply saw them. And oddly enough, that made them uncomfortable. Because when somebody sees the real you, all the masks suddenly become harder to wear. The death card is here, and the energy around it feels incredibly personal, not dramatic, not scary, just deeply personal. It's the feeling of standing at the edge of an old identity and realizing you're not sure you can carry it any further. I think this person is grieving something, not necessarily a relationship, not necessarily a person, a version of themselves. The version that cared so much about what everyone else thought. The version that needed outside validation before making decisions. The version that kept choosing comfort over authenticity. Because authenticity is expensive. It costs certainty. It costs approval. It sometimes costs relationships. And I feel like this person is beginning to understand that. Honestly, Aries, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people around them are confused by these changes. People get comfortable with who they think someone is. And when that person starts evolving, it can make others uncomfortable. So there may be resistance, there may be judgment, there may be people questioning their choices. But the interesting thing is, I don't think those voices sound as convincing as they once did. That's changing, slowly, quietly. But it's changing, and I feel like that's creating an internal conflict. Part of them still wants everyone's approval. Part of them still wants everything to stay simple. Part of them still wants to avoid difficult conversations. But another part is growing louder. A part that wants freedom. A part that wants honesty. A part that wants to stop pretending. You know, the energy almost feels like somebody standing in front of a mirror and recognizing themselves for the first time. Not because their appearance changed, because their perspective did. And once perspective changes, everything else begins changing too. Even their memories look different. Even their regrets look different. Even this connection looks different. Because I don't think they're viewing you through the same lens anymore. The labels are falling away. The assumptions are falling away. The fears are being questioned. And what remains underneath all of that is something much harder for them to dismiss. Something real. Something they've been trying to understand. Something that keeps resurfacing no matter how many times they try to focus elsewhere. Because while they're sorting through all these beliefs, all these expectations, all these old stories they've carried for years, another realization seems to be waiting quietly in the background. And the closer they get to that realization, the harder it becomes to keep pretending that nothing inside them has changed. Because what keeps surfacing underneath all of this isn't confidence. It's vulnerability. And Aries, I think that's what this person has been trying to avoid for a very long time. Sometimes people would rather stay busy than sit alone with their own heart. They'll work harder, stay distracted, keep moving, keep planning, keep fixing things around them, anything to avoid the one conversation they don't want to have with themselves. But the energy feels different here. The Hermit is showing up, and honestly, I don't feel like this person is running from silence anymore. I feel like they're walking into it. Not because it's comfortable, because they're exhausted. Exhausted from pretending certain feelings don't exist. Exhausted from carrying stories they've repeated for years. Exhausted from being strong in all the wrong places. And I keep seeing somebody sitting alone somewhere, maybe in their car, maybe unable to sleep, maybe staring at a ceiling at 2 a.m, not searching for answers anymore, just finally allowing themselves to feel. Because there is a difference, a huge difference. And what they're feeling isn't anger, it isn't resentment, it isn't even confusion. It's sadness, a very quiet sadness. The kind that appears when someone realizes they may have misunderstood something important, or someone important. The moon is sitting here, Aries. And every time I look at it, I get the feeling that this person spent years trusting fear more than they've trusted themselves. Fear was familiar. Fear felt safe. Fear gave them reasons to stay guarded, reasons to keep people at a distance, reasons not to fully invest, reasons not to fully believe. And when somebody has lived that way long enough, they stop noticing they're doing it. It simply becomes part of who they are. But something is changing, because the same fears that once protected them are no longer making sense. They keep looking at them from different angles, questioning them, pulling them apart, and I have to say, Aries, one fear keeps showing up stronger than the others. The fear of not being enough, not successful enough, not stable enough, not healed enough, not lovable enough. It's almost heartbreaking because I don't think many people know this about them. From the outside, they may appear confident, capable, put together, but underneath all of that, there has been a voice following them for years. A voice constantly asking, what if they see who I really am? Because what if who they really are isn't good enough? What if people leave? What if they disappoint someone? What if they fail? What if they get hurt? And I think that voice became so familiar they started believing it. Honestly, Aries, I feel like there were moments when this person looked at you and saw qualities in you that they couldn't see in themselves. Not because you were perfect, not because you had everything figured out, but because you carried a certain authenticity, a certain courage, a certain willingness to be yourself. And instead of inspiring them at first, it triggered something. Because when somebody shines a light on parts of ourselves we've been avoiding, it can feel uncomfortable. And that's where strength appears. Not loudly, not dramatically, almost gently. Because I don't think strength looks like fighting anymore for this person. I think strength looks like honesty. Looking in the mirror and admitting things they never wanted to admit. Admitting where fear made decisions. Admitting where pride got involved. Admitting where insecurity disguised itself as logic. Admitting where they pushed away things they secretly wanted. That's not easy. Not at all. And I think this is why they've been revisiting old memories from a completely different perspective. They're not just remembering what happened. They're examining why it happened, why they reacted the way they did, why they pulled back, why they hesitated, why they stayed silent, why they convinced themselves they had more time. Sometimes regret isn't about losing something. Sometimes regret is realizing you had something valuable and couldn't recognize it at the time. That energy feels very present here, not overwhelming, not consuming, just present, like a quiet realization sitting in the corner of a room. And I don't think this person is blaming you anymore. That's important because for a long time it may have been easier to focus on circumstances, timing, distance, misunderstandings, anything outside of themselves. But the Hermit keeps pulling them inward, back toward their own choices, back toward their own fears, back toward the moments when they abandon themselves. Because every time we abandon ourselves, we end up abandoning other things too. Other people, other opportunities, other possibilities. And I think that's a difficult truth they're beginning to face. Not to punish themselves, not to live in guilt, just to understand, to finally understand. Because the more self-awareness arrives, the harder it becomes to keep telling the old story. The old story says they weren't ready. The old story says circumstances were impossible. The old story says there was nothing they could do. But another story is beginning to emerge, a quieter one, a more honest one. A story that asks whether fear had a much bigger role than they ever wanted to acknowledge. And Aries, the moment somebody begins questioning that story, everything starts shifting. Because once fear is identified, it loses some of its power. Once it's seen clearly, it becomes harder to obey. And I keep feeling this person standing at the edge of something emotionally significant. Not action, not decisions, not outcomes, just awareness, pure awareness. The kind that changes someone from the inside before anything changes on the outside. And the deeper they go into that awareness, the more another feeling seems to be emerging beneath all of it. A feeling they haven't fully allowed themselves to touch yet, because that feeling seems to be growing into something much larger than they expected. Not urgency, not obsession, something quieter, something steadier, and honestly, Aries, that surprises them, because for a long time, they associated love with intensity, the chase, the uncertainty, the emotional highs and lows, the feeling of constantly reaching for something just out of reach. But lately, when they imagine happiness, it doesn't look like that anymore. It looks peaceful, it looks stable, it looks real. And that's where the lovers keeps pulling my attention. Not because this person is sitting around fantasizing all day. It's deeper than that. It's the way their priorities are beginning to shift. The things that used to impress them don't carry the same weight anymore. The things they once thought were essential suddenly feel temporary. And I keep hearing this question repeating in their energy. What actually matters? You know, that question changes people. Because once somebody starts asking it honestly, they begin looking at their life through a completely different lens. The people around them, the goals they're pursuing, the relationships they're investing in, the future they're creating, everything gets reevaluated. And I feel like that's exactly what's happening here. This person is no longer looking for excitement alone. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for consistency. They're looking for something they can trust. Something that doesn't disappear the moment life becomes complicated. Something that remains when appearances fade, when distractions disappear, when reality shows up. And Aries, whether they fully understand it yet or not, your energy keeps appearing in those reflections. Not because they're forcing it, not because they're trying to compare. It just keeps happening naturally. The Two of Cups is sitting here, and every time I look at it, I get the feeling that this person is beginning to understand partnership differently than they did before. Partnership used to feel like compromise, responsibility, obligation, pressure, but something about their perspective is softening. They're beginning to see partnership as support, connection, friendship, safety, the feeling of having somebody beside you rather than somebody standing across from you. And I have to say, I don't think this realization arrived through success. I think it arrived through disappointment, because sometimes we only learn what matters after discovering what doesn't. Sometimes we spend years chasing things that look important, only to realize they leave us feeling empty. And I feel like this person has experienced enough of that, enough temporary situations, enough surface-level interactions, enough relationships where something important was always missing. The strange thing is that they may not have recognized what was missing at the time, but they recognize it now. They recognize the absence. They recognize the difference, and that difference keeps leading their thoughts back toward you. Not necessarily toward specific conversations, not necessarily toward specific memories, toward a feeling they experienced around you that has become harder to find anywhere else. Okay, that feels significant, because this isn't really about nostalgia. It's about comparison without meaning to compare. It's about living life, meeting people, experiencing different situations, and slowly realizing that something about your connection continues to stand apart. The Ten of Pentacles is here, Aries, and the energy around it feels surprisingly mature. I don't feel impulsiveness. I don't feel fantasy. I feel contemplation. I feel somebody imagining what life could look like years from now. Not next week, not next month, years from now. And when those thoughts appear, they're no longer focused solely on achievements. They're no longer focused solely on status. They're no longer focused solely on proving something to the world. The picture is becoming more personal, more human, more heartfelt. I keep seeing somebody imagining simple moments. Coming home after a long day, sharing a meal, laughing over something small, building traditions, creating memories, growing older with someone who truly understands them. And honestly, I think that vision scares them a little. Not because they don't want it, because they do. Because wanting something real requires vulnerability. It requires investment. It requires trust. And trust hasn't always come easily for this person. But despite that fear, the desire keeps growing. The desire for stability. The desire for consistency. The desire to stop running from things that matter. You know, for some people, maturity isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming honest. And this person feels more honest with themselves than they have in a very long time. They're admitting things, acknowledging things, allowing themselves to imagine possibilities they would have dismissed before. And every time they do, your energy seems to appear somewhere within those possibilities. Not as a fantasy, not as an escape, as somebody who represents something meaningful, something lasting, something worth protecting. I also feel this person becoming increasingly aware of how much energy they've spent searching outside themselves for answers, searching for validation, searching for certainty, searching for direction. And yet the answers they're finding lately seem to come from a much quieter place. A place that keeps asking them what kind of life they actually want. Not what other people want for them, not what looks impressive, not what earns approval, what feels true. And Aries, the closer they get to that answer, the more another realization seems to be emerging. A realization that isn't about the future itself. It's about the role they may have played in delaying the future they truly wanted. And that's a realization they're only beginning to sit with. Because once someone realizes they've been standing in their own way, staying still becomes much harder. And Aries, that's the feeling I'm getting here. Not impatience, not pressure, movement. The kind of movement that starts long before anyone sees it on the outside. A decision forming quietly inside someone's heart. A decision that keeps returning, no matter how many times they try to postpone it. The Ace of Swords is sitting here, and honestly, it feels like clarity arriving after a very long period of noise. Not perfect clarity, not all the answers, just enough truth to make pretending impossible. Because I keep seeing this person reaching a point where certain excuses don't work anymore. The explanations they've given themselves, the reasons they've used to delay things, the stories they've repeated over and over. They're beginning to lose their power. And I think that's uncomfortable. You know, there comes a moment when a person realizes they've spent more energy avoiding something than it would have taken to face it. That's the energy here. Because facing reality is scary. But carrying it forever is exhausting. And I feel exhaustion all over this reading. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The kind that comes from constantly arguing with your own heart. The kind that comes from knowing what you feel but refusing to acknowledge it. The kind that comes from standing at a crossroads for so long that neither direction feels comfortable anymore. This person seems tired of that. Tired of wondering. Tired of circling the same thoughts. Tired of imagining conversations they never have. Tired of replaying moments they wish had gone differently. Okay, that feels important. Because I don't think they're focused on perfection anymore. For a long time, they may have believed they needed to have everything figured out before making a move. Everything healed. Everything organized. Everything solved. But life doesn't really work that way, does it? Sometimes people wait so long for the perfect moment that they miss the moments that mattered, and I feel like that realization has been weighing heavily on them lately. The Chariot appears, and immediately the energy changes. Not faster, more determined, like somebody finally picking a direction after wandering for miles. Because uncertainty can feel safe. When you're uncertain, you don't have to risk anything. You don't have to be vulnerable. You don't have to hear answers you may not want. But certainty requires courage. Action requires courage, and courage is becoming a much bigger theme in this person's life than they expected. Honestly, Aries, I don't think this is somebody who wants to keep living from fear anymore. Fear has already taken enough from them. Fear has already convinced them to stay silent. Fear has already convinced them to hesitate. Fear has already convinced them to second-guess their own feelings. And the more clearly they see that, the less attractive fear becomes. Because what once felt like protection is starting to look more like a prison. I also feel something else happening here. Accountability. Not self-punishment. Not shame. Accountability. A willingness to look at certain situations and admit, maybe I could have handled that differently. That's not easy. Most people spend their lives avoiding that level of honesty. But this person feels increasingly willing to sit with it. To acknowledge moments where they withdrew. Moments where they became defensive. Moments where they misunderstood what was right in front of them. And Aries. I think part of them wishes they could rewrite some of those moments. Not because they hate themselves. Because they finally understand their significance. The Page of Wands keeps catching my attention. And the energy feels surprisingly hopeful. Not naive. Not unrealistic. Just open, like somebody becoming curious again. Curious about possibilities. Curious about what could happen if they approached life differently. Curious about what could happen if they stopped assuming the worst. Curious about what could happen if they actually listened to their heart for once instead of immediately talking themselves out of it. You know, curiosity is powerful because curiosity creates movement. It invites action. It opens doors. And I feel like this person is beginning to step into that energy. Not because all their fears are gone. Their fears are still there. Not because every uncertainty has disappeared. There are still questions, still concerns, still things they need to work through. But something important has shifted. The fear is no longer driving. That's what feels different. For the first time, It feels like some deeper is beginning to take the wheel. Something more authentic. Something more aligned with who they actually are. And I have to say, when I look at these cards together, I don't see somebody trying to escape their feelings anymore. I see somebody trying to understand what those feelings are asking of them. That's a completely different journey, because understanding leads to responsibility, and responsibility often leads to action, not reckless action, not impulsive action, meaningful action. The kind that comes after reflection. The kind that comes after growth. The kind that comes after somebody finally stops running long enough to hear their own truth. And what makes this energy so emotional is that I don't think they're only thinking about what they've lost. They're thinking about what could still be possible, what could still be repaired, what could still be understood, what could still be said, because there are words sitting in this person's heart that have remained there for a very long time. Words they never found the courage to speak. Words they convinced themselves weren't necessary. Words they thought would somehow become easier to say later. But later has a way of becoming its own kind of burden. And those unspoken words feel heavier than they used to. Almost as if they're asking to be acknowledged. Almost as if they're waiting for the moment when this person finally stops rehearsing conversations in their head and decides what to do with everything they've been carrying. Aries, I think I'll leave this reading right here. There's a feeling that some chapters don't close because they're unfinished. They stay in the background of our lives, quietly asking to be understood from a different perspective. Whatever this connection means to you, I hope this reading gave you something to reflect on. Thank you for being here and sharing a little piece of your time with me. It truly means a lot. Take care of yourself, keep moving forward in your own way, and trust yourself a little more than you did yesterday. I'll see you again very soon. Bye, Aries.